This is Larry Rosenthal of the Goldman School with Step 5, Project the Outcomes. Some tips. We'll talk about what's involved at this stage of the Eightfold Path in general terms. We'll turn towards some questions to bear in mind. We'll talk about some important steps that the analyst takes here. We'll discuss what beginners tend to find difficult. And lastly, 2 examples of outcome inquiries. First, what's involved with projecting the outcomes generally? Thus far in the Eightfold Path, we've done good work. We've defined a problem and assembled some evidence, and then we framed the analysis by choosing the alternatives and the criteria that will be in play. Now, projecting the outcomes involves hard thinking about how these alternatives will each work in practice. Once we predict their outcomes in a careful and hopefully accurate way, then and only then can we evaluate those outcomes in terms of our selected criteria. In fact, projecting the outcomes successfully is necessary for utilizing the criteria meaningfully. It's important to note Bardak's choice of a verb here. Projecting doesn't involve ascertaining absolute certainty. Rather, it involves educated guesswork, an informed prediction, and what we might call estimates about these alternatives' impacts in the world. The goal is a set of reasoned, thoughtful conjectures representing progress that we've made because we've undertaken the analysis. The effort is to try to answer this question for each alternative. What will happen if the alternative is implemented as public policy? Some questions that analysts often bear in mind at this stage of the Eightfold Path. First, what specific change or changes will the alternative introduce in the world? Next, what people and organizations will be most directly affected by these changes? We might consider them to be the stakeholders. How are those people and organizations likely to react? Are there analogous situations from which we can draw inferences about the outcomes of each of these alternatives? And now 2 questions about your thinking as an analyst. First, what more would you need to know for you to find your own expectations about outcomes to be credible? And lastly, which of your beliefs about these outcomes seem most likely to be true, and which require you to be more guarded in your projections? And of course, there'll be room when we arrive at our recommended policy and tell our story at the end of the Eightfold Path to nuance our recommendation based upon our confidence in our projections. Now we turn towards important steps that analysts often take at this stage of the Eightfold Path. First, they revisit selected criteria in order to identify measures, sometimes called metrics, that they'll use to translate outcomes into goal-specific consequences. This process of coming up with these measures is key to success in projecting the outcomes and then preparing to confront the trade-offs at the next step of the Eightfold Path. To assist with this work, consider constructing an outcomes matrix to help you address the specifics of this projection process and then keep your work organized. Remember that you can speak to stakeholders. You can reach out to them in order to learn more about the behavioral responses that you should expect for each alternative. You'll be able to improve your guesswork by speaking to the people involved. Next, go back to your alternatives and review your assumptions. Try and ensure that the proposed alternative will likely have its intended effect. Lastly, remember to be realistic, because doing so is the fundamental contribution that public policy analysis can make. Realism is one of our most important advantages in public policy analysis. Let's discuss what students tend to find difficult at this stage. First, because they've thought of their own alternatives, they often have excessive optimism about how well those alternatives will work. Projecting the outcomes means challenging your assumptions and ensuring that you're being realistic. Next, students are often apprehensive, simply because when we project the outcomes, when we try to predict the future, there is some risk of being wrong. And it's important to become comfortable with that risk, and that takes practice. Next, as a general outlook on life, many people are simply uncomfortable with uncertainty. And it's important to recognize that and to gain a comfort level as we make educated guesses, estimates about what these alternatives will bring in the future. Next, students often have a great respect for the unknown. Therefore, they live in a relatively agnostic way. And that respect remains in place, but now we practice the process of informing ourselves of what's more likely to happen than not with respect to each of these alternatives. Another concern for students is that they may be operating in challenging political environments, and that means that when they think about reporting these predictions, they expect only scarce credibility. They don't believe that the most important stakeholders will believe the analysis. This is difficult, and it's important to convince oneself. If you can tell a story that you believe, then you will have completed this step of the Eightfold Path and succeeded at it. We also recall that students confront new and complex techniques at this stage. Techniques of statistics, reasoning, logic, work in systems theory, and the like. Just getting comfortable with new techniques is part of the challenge. It's important to remember that a thoughtful and a well-informed guess about the future makes an important contribution to public policy. That's why working very hard at this stage to complete the process of projecting the outcome successfully is so important. Before we conclude, let's discuss two examples of the kinds of inquiries that will be undertaken when we try to project the outcomes. First, take the problem that we've discussed in prior video lectures, too much childhood obesity. Imagine that there's an alternative placed on the table in the analysis, which is to impose a 3% sales tax on sugar-sweetened beverages. The intersection is with the criterion of effectiveness and reduced consumption. On our matrix, we'll have a row named 3% sales tax, a column named effectiveness on reduced consumption, and we'll ask ourselves, what's going to happen? One way to stylize that inquiry is to ask the question, how big a drop in consumption can be expected if we increase the purchase price by 3%? Students of economics will recognize that this essentially is a question of elasticity. How will the demand for sugar-sweetened beverages change in response to a 3% increase in the price due to this tax? Answering that accurately, at least making an informed guess about what's likely to happen with demand, is a key element of this projection for this problem. The second example involves a problem we might define as too many high-speed accidents on Highway 12. Let's say that the analyst has placed on the table the alternative of reducing the speed limit to 35 miles an hour. Next, let's look at two criteria. First, maximizing traffic safety, presumably through reducing the number and the severity of these accidents. And secondly, implementing this alternative, this reduced speed limit, at least overall cost. The outcome questions that we should bear in mind and that will frame the inquiry is first, on the safety item, how much loss due to these accidents, in terms of lives lost, injuries, and property damage, will be avoided by enforcing the lower speed limit. There may well be research literature that has taken highway safety data and utilized the speed of the vehicles at the time of the accident and the level of the posted speed limit and related those elements to the overall damages, lost lives, injuries, and property damage that result. On the criteria of least cost, the criterion, I should say, one question we might ask is, well, what will enforcing this new speed limit require? We can imagine that we'll have to post more signs, perhaps have more highway patrol officers out in the field giving out tickets. A related question, of course, when our criterion is least overall cost, is how much revenue those speeding tickets will generate, because after all, that will reduce our overall cost. We've addressed step 5, project the outcomes. We've talked about a number of items. We've gone over what's involved generally. We've raised some questions that you should bear in mind. We've presented a number of important steps that analysts take at this stage of the Eightfold Path. And then we've talked about what beginners find difficult. Lastly, we've gone over these two examples of outcome inquiries relating to problems of childhood obesity and highway safety. Thanks for your attention, and now we'll move on to the next unit.